Audio unleashed.
Dennis, you know what time it is?
What time is it, buddy?
It's time to make the audio
unleashed
podcast.
Let's do it.
What are we talking about?
Man. Boy, I think.
Are you starting or am I starting?
You're starting. Yeah. I'm gonna jump us off here. So, I think given the amount of feedback that we had to the last episode, it's time for a reader mailbag segment. We had a lot of comments on the YouTube page. We had a lot of comments on the Patreon page. We've had discussions in other forums about this, the topic of conversation was specifically audio science reviews, criticisms of Danny Ritchie in general. So I don't think we necessarily defended Danny, but I think we pointed out some what we would consider unfair criticism against him, and also highlighted what we consider to be some fair criticism. But people took issues with it on both sides of the debate. So we got a lot of comments here to work with, and I think we're just going to go through them and sort of react to the reactions, if we will.
Okay.
What do you want to talk about?
Well, there is, I noticed, I was shocked that to get a letter from Sonos the other day. And,
in the mail?
In the email, the modern mail, that basically apologized for all the sort of missteps they've made with their app. And I got that letter to, I don't know how many emails I got it to, at least 2. And then I got a letter or an email from their PR people. And the letter was from the CEO, of the company. And I was shocked to get that. And then I was kind of wondering why. And then I went to, I went to look at Wirecutter, my own employer. I went to look at our coverage of Sonos and see if we've said anything about that. And as it turned out, I discovered, because nobody asks me about these things, I discovered that we have pulled our recommendation of Sonos, and it was you who did it.
Yeah. Well, I had backup. It ultimately was not, I could not have gone in and made the executive decision to do that, but I am the one who started that conversation. So that's a lot of weight, dude.
So there's a lot going on with Sonos.
Yes. It's weird to see that a decision I've made, basically ripple out into the news. Anyway, weird.
And this has been, this is Wirecutter's recommended Sonos for, I think, at least 10 years. And sort of also made kind of a blanket recommendation of, just buy Sonos whenever there were multi-room systems discussed. And, and Sonos has been one of the big success stories in the audio industry of the last 20 years. That's for sure. Yeah. And, so many people had bought into that ecosystem. And yet it seems like it's starting to fade. And we can discuss that because you have in-depth knowledge and I really don't.
Yeah. People are going to get a peek inside the thought process of what happens when we're working on a guide, because I am just starting to rewrite this thing. So I hope our New York Times overlords don't get upset by the transparency here. But oh well. We're
talking about Sonos. We're talking about Sonos. So Sonos is the story. True. You're the journalist. You're not the story. You're not Hunter Thompson.
That is the truest thing you've ever said.
Not yet.
Anyway. Yeah. So anyway, after that, you had many years ago turned me on to the Your Morning Coffee podcast. And you usually, often you will send me episodes that are particularly noteworthy. And you sent a link to a recent special edition with Will Page. That was a fascinating discussion. Basically, long story short, sort of talking about how a lot of the things that we've talked about before, how the algorithms and the pay system in streaming ecosystems affect basically everything. I think one of the biggest takeaways that you talked about in your little note that you sent me was it's becoming a lot more common to put the chorus right up front, right? Because of the way the U.S. pay structure is, and streams, if they play for 30 seconds, you can get people hooked, you get more money, basically, or you get money at all. So anyway, there's a lot to unpack there, and we're going to talk about it and talk about what we thought was cool. And
the bottom line is we don't talk that much about the music industry, but in this case, the music industry is affecting what we hear as audiophiles. It's changing the nature of the music that we literally listen to. And so, normally a streaming service is just supposed to deliver something. It's just supposed to be a means of getting something, but it's turning out to be something that is having its own editorial effect on the music.
Yeah.
Wittingly or unwittingly.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are we going to do for patrons this week, man?
We're going to talk about a review, which I think kind of stands in contrast to a lot of what we're going to talk about with Audio Science Review and Danny Ritchie. And it's by Herb Reichert, who is a stereophile reviewer. It's a review of the Harbeth P3ESR-XD speaker and this subwoofer stand. It's a stand for the speaker. This is a bookshelf speaker. And the stand actually has a subwoofer built into it. But I really wanted to highlight this because, we talk so much about, measurements and, the importance of blind listening tests and stuff. But this is a review that incorporates, there's measurements in it, but wait, were there? I don't think there were. But although Stereophile has measured this Harbeth speaker before, but it was all subjective impression, and yet I thought it was really great. I thought it was really interesting, and it's the kind of stuff that I'd like to see more of in reviewing, and a little bit less of the sort of lazy, blah, blah, inner detail, yada, 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 something or another. I listened to the Von Carry-on something, and there was lots of microdynamics or something. Yeah. And it's not like that at all. It's actually, he really has a lot of philosophical discussion about what, the differences among loudspeakers and why they're worth discussing. And so we're going to dig a little deeper into that. And that's not something we usually do, but, hey, we are sort of fence-sitting wusses here, and
we don't better when we call ourselves Statler and Waldorf. Come on, man.
Yeah, but we are not blindly adhering to any path in audio. We kind of look at what people have, and we don't and we have a certain level of disdain for people that are very sure of themselves and that loudly proclaim how right they are and how wrong everybody else is. And speaking of that, I think it's time to segue.
That was one of your best segues ever, man. You're getting really good at this.
I think it's time to segue into a discussion of Audio Science Review versus Danny Ritchie, round 2.
Ding, ding. I want, if you don't mind, to start with a comment from Daniel Ho on our YouTube channel, because I don't have a lot to say about this other than it was my favorite comment. Anybody laughed. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read it if that's okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Daniel says, audio has long been dominated by crazies who threw science under the bus and treated audio like a mystic cult you couldn't enter unless you recited their little red book of imaginary nonsense. So I get excited when I learned about ASR, it's Audio Science Review, a measurement-focused audio website. Unfortunately, I've learned that ASR is dominated by crazies who throw psychoacoustics under the bus and treat audio like a spreadsheet fantasy league you couldn't enter unless you recited their manifesto of minutia beneath the threshold of audibility. Just buy Floyd Toole's book and be the outcast who enjoys good audio without the idolatry. I think that comment stands on its own. It does not require a lot of feedback from me. What do you think?
Well, I mean, you described, I think in our last episode, you described Audio Science Review as audio data review. And I would say there's a point to that. I mean, the whole concept of it is, here's this guy who I guess made some money off Microsoft and, bought a Clipple and bought a Audio Precision. That's a substantial investment. That's an investment somewhere in the and he also bought a whatever headphone rig he uses. So he's got a good solid $150,000 worth of investment and all this stuff, and basically took the Harman research right on speakers and headphones and said, okay, I'm going to use this gear and evaluate how closely it comes to how closely the speakers and headphones come to the Harman ideal, right?
Yeah.
All right. I should say Harman and National Research Council of Canada, where this research was all all the speaker research originated there. So, and the Harman stuff is one of the real foundations of psychoacoustics that we have. So since he's basing what he does on the Harman stuff, it's not really fair to say it throws psychoacoustics under the bus. Okay. It's very measurement oriented, but those measurements are judged on the basis of research that involved psychoacoustics. Does that make any sense?
It does. It really does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Now, I think we got another letter.
We did. We got a comment on our Patreon from Jay-Z that I thought was great. Here's the comment. I'll just read it in full. Regarding Danny Ritchie, I think Brent and Dennis make some fair technical points here on his behalf, but Ritchie also outlandishly claims to improve with his upgrade kits various speaker models from Revel and JBL, two premier Harman brands. I just find these claims by Ritchie ludicrous on their face. If Danny really is able to best Revel and JBL engineers at their own game, then I think there is a much bigger bombshell of a story here. Brent and Dennis, what say you? Should we give credence to Danny's claims about Revel and JBL products? If so, then wow. Oh, wow. And he provided a couple of links to videos by Danny. One of them is, does high-end name equal high performance? Revel M106. The other one is, what the heck was Revel thinking? Revel Performa M22 upgrades. And in this, he basically is providing the sort of technical analysis that he usually does. Although I think with these videos, we start to understand how Danny's monetization model, selling kits to quote unquote improve speakers, sometimes colors his impressions, right? I mean, if your job is to improve speakers, then you're going to find problems with speakers no matter what, right? So, what do you think about it?
Well, I'd watched these videos that Jay-Z recommended, and I mean, there's a point to be had. Look, this, he's talking about in one of them the Revel Performance series, which I used to own, and they're the one M106. It's an incredibly great speaker, right? But Danny takes it apart, and of course, it was made to hit a price point. I think it was $2,000 a pair, and it still is. It's still out there. You can buy it, and even at $2,000 a pair, you've got to make some compromises. And, they used what Danny considered to be lower quality parts. Now, and his kit basically replaces those lower quality parts with higher quality parts. Now, does that make the speaker audibly better? Well, that's not established, right? But I mean, a lot of the things that people do, you're a car guy, a lot of the upgrades that people make to their cars supposedly for performance, do they really make a difference? I don't know. There's so many things.
I'm not a car guy. I'm a Corvette guy.
You're a Corvette
but to your
guy.
point,
okay.
I'd love to replace the air intake on my dad's Vet, but it would be of significant cost and would give us 5 extra horsepower, right?
Yeah, or like guitars. People are always tweaking out their guitars with stuff, and sometimes it makes a difference, and sometimes it doesn't. So it's like, I mean, if people want to, I don't think Danny's. He actually, let me take that statement back. When he's got one of his videos titled, "What the heck was Revel thinking?" I got to say, it's like, well, Danny, Revel had to hit a price point. How about if you hit the same price point and tell us how you're going to do that and take Revel's, manufacturing economics into account. Okay. Yeah. Anybody can tear apart any high-end speaker and go, oh, well, they should have used blah, blah here instead of blah, blah. Anybody can do that. That is not hard to do. The only skill you need to do that is operating a screwdriver. Okay. So but it's like, can these speakers be improved? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Or can you get the joy of upgrading something, which we all kind of do with something or another? Well, yeah, I mean, I've done that with bicycles. I've changed out the components on bikes, and sometimes it made it better, and sometimes it made it worse. And I hate to say that, JBL and Revel are perfect, and although they're edging up against it, but they could be improved. But I wanted to talk about Amir contacted us, I believe, right? From Audio Science Review.
Yeah, and there was a little bit of controversy here. We got accused of deleting a comment from Amir, which we never did. You know, somebody came in and said, it's sad that you deleted Amir's long and detailed response. Well, I looked back through all of the logs on our YouTube channel. It never even made it to moderation. So I think what happened is he tried to submit it. It got rejected because of a link or something like that. We got all of that sorted out. And Amir, if you are listening and you thought we blocked that comment, apologies, dude. We absolutely didn't, but I'm glad the comment made it through. So do you want me to just start reading this and let you respond?
I'm just going to say,
Sure.
I don't know about, I'm sure you would share in this, but I would never delete a comment unless it was, I think I've had one guy blocked on Wirecutter because he was accusing me of all these, conflicts of interest, which were just idiotic. And he just wouldn't let up. But that's I wouldn't block a comment because, frankly, I've fought all these battles before. I've been doing this since the early 90s, okay? I got, what is that line from, there's like a James Wood line from, I can't remember. Oh, no, it's from a Saturday Night Live thing where he's like, I got chunks of tougher guys than you in my stool, okay?
Well, also, I'm just never going to delete a comment because sometimes the comments are right, man. I think Jay-Z, with his comment on a Patreon, taking us to task, I think he had a good point. And I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding there because there have been several times people have said to us, why do you keep defending Danny Ritchie? And my point of view is, we're not defending Danny Ritchie. I'm not even saying I'm a fan of Danny Ritchie. We often say, hey, go watch this specific Danny Ritchie video because in this specific video, he nailed it, right? That is not a blanket endorsement of him. And also, no criticism of anybody is a blanket criticism of anybody. It's take specific issues, break them apart. I think Danny, I personally, just me speaking, I think Danny's a lot kookier than I think you do, right? But when he's firing on all cylinders, dude, it's a masterclass.
Yeah,
but we specifically say, watch this specific video.
Look, in our Patreon segment, we're going to be talking about a review from Herb Reichert and Stereophile, who I've criticized many, many times. But, sometimes even people who we generally disagree with, we get it right sometimes, and it deserves to be pointed out. I just want to say, I respect Amir. I respect Danny. I think they both make a vital contribution to this field. And, same with, people like Gene Della Sala, Doug Schneider, all these people, they're all making their own contribution. I mean, but as we've said before, I think, I think as we were saying somewhere or another, if you think somebody's right about everything, you're an idiot. And if you think somebody's wrong about everything, you're also an idiot. Okay. So, Amir pointed out a couple things that I wanted to talk about, but could you please serve them up to me so I have my bat waiting.
Do you want me to start at the top or do you want me to skip down a little bit?
Oh, I don't have the letter in front of me, unfortunately.
Okay, so let me just start at the top. Amir says, while there is truism in a number of things Brent mentions, there are some wrong assumptions. Danny has never shown a ground plane measurement, much less stitched them to the gated measurements. The latter, as I am sure you know, has highly reduced resolution, even above 200 hertz. When you're in the business of selling speakers, as Danny is, you better show full response, including bass. Not doing so results in decades of selling a speaker with this disastrous bass response, and he links to a video showing disastrous bass response.
Let's stop right there. Now,
sure.
The fact that he has one video of one speaker that Danny, I think it's a speaker Danny built. That's a full range speaker. It's a little like full range 3.5-inch, 4-inch driver with, it's like, is that disastrous bass response? I mean, when you're struggling when you've got a little tiny speaker with one driver and you have a big giant hump in the bass, well, I measure lots of speakers that are like that. Little cheap speakers, Bluetooth speakers, right? Where you pump the bass way up to give it the impression of bass. The famous LS35A had something like that, right? It's done. Now that is psychoacoustics. That's done to balance out the sound and give the speaker the impression of having bass. It's kind of like making the most of what you have to work with. And this is where I really have problems with some of the things Amir does. Okay. I don't know the guy, but as I understand it, he came out of the computer industry, Microsoft, not revered for audio products. So I'm guessing he was not involved in audio product development. And then I see him and this other guy, Rick Sikora, I think his name was, criticizing Danny for only showing 200 hertz and up. But I have been involved in audio product development. I've consulted for a lot of people. And, when you're doing audio product development, as really is what Danny's doing, okay, you don't necessarily you don't do a full suite of measurements every time you do a change, right? You do a change, you run typically like a single on-axis sweep, and the change that you're doing doesn't affect usually the entire range of the speaker. And especially if you're tweaking a crossover, it's not really going to affect the bass response, right? So I was just going through some of my measurements. I'm like, I got tons of measurements of all sorts of things where it's only 200, 300, whatever hertz on up, because I didn't need anything more than that. I was going through an old Martin Collins review in Stereophile of this Sonos Faber speaker from 30 years ago or more. And he did the same thing. And this is a common thing to do in audio product development, but the people that are doing this don't really seem to have any grasp of audio product development. And they're it's sort of like, and this is a problem I want to talk about. With the Clipple. Okay, the Clipple is it's an automated device. I don't have one. I have seen them. I've talked to the Clipple people a lot. Basically, you put the speaker in there, you hit a on-screen button, you walk away, and an hour later or whatever, you have a full set of measurements on the speaker, right? And they use techniques to, eliminate the acoustics of the room from the measurement. Well, great. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, and more speaker manufacturers are buying them because they're really expensive, but they're a lot cheaper than an anechoic chamber. They're a lot easier to deal with. They take up very little real estate, and, it's kind of pushing anechoic chambers out of the way. The downside of a Clipple for reviewers is that you don't really need to know much about what you're doing to run one. Whereas I think, you've seen me do quasi-anechoic measurements, and that's the way they've been done until the Clipple came along. Everybody who did measurements who didn't have an anechoic chamber did the quasi-anechoic technique, which uses gating to, get rid of the room effects, or to, get rid of the effects of your surroundings, because I measure outside usually. It's very complicated to do. You've seen me do it, right? I think.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's unbelievably complicated to do.
Yep.
And it's difficult. And it has, as Amir correctly pointed out, the resolution of that measurement, of the quasi-anechoic measurement, once from about 200 to 1,000 hertz is pretty low. So, and I think Floyd Toole points that out in his book. I mean, it's very well known. John Atkinson points it out. Everybody knows this and knows it's a problem, and you do things to combat it, right? But the thing is, it used to be when people wanted to measure speakers, it was a very long learning process. And, you spent a lot of time learning how to do it and making a lot of mistakes and learning from your mistakes. And as soon as you met somebody else who did it, another speaker, a speaker designer, another reviewer, somebody like that, boy, you immediately went to talking about measuring speakers. And I've had so many in-depth discussions with, almost every major speaker designer you could name, right? About measuring speakers. And I've gained so much knowledge from that. And also, you talk about what matters, what doesn't. You'd be surprised. I was just remembering this, and I had a really good discussion with Wendell Diller from Magnapan. And you might think, well, Magnapan's just a sheet of Mylar with a diaphragm on it. You wouldn't, what are you going to measure? It's like, but he had really in-depth understanding of measurements, and I was measuring some of his speakers for Sound and Vision years ago, and he had it was a great discussion, all by email, but it's like, I learned stuff, and I didn't expect to. And there's what they call the measurement community. And when you did those kind of measurements, when you did measurements that were difficult to do, you relied on the measurement community, all right? And you built relationships and you learned things. Nowadays, you can go buy a Clipple and you are not really part of the measurement community, right? It's kind of like, I bought my lightsaber, now I'm a Jedi. And
brilliant.
And so anyway, I want to go a little deeper though, but they're talking about like Danny not measuring bass. It's like, well, number one, I mean, there are times when he would need to. I haven't watched all of his videos.
No.
I mean,
we were specifically talking about the video that he was doing, I think that was referencing, like, if he is deconstructing a speaker to figure out how he would, quote unquote, improve the crossovers.
Yeah.
What does he need sub 200 hertz measurements for?
Right. And also, they kind of imply that maybe Danny doesn't know how to do that. But, I have used quasi-anechoic measurements of various sorts, including LMS, Clio, Praxis, Sample Champion, Room EQ Wizard. At least 5, probably more, probably some I've forgotten because it's been, I don't know, 30 years.
Right.
And all of them show, how to measure bass, right? So the idea that Danny somehow doesn't know how to do that is, it's just part of the learning process. It's kind of like, if someone said to you, I know how to drive, but I don't know how to use a car's turn signals. You'd be kind of like, what?
That seems like most people, if you're basing it on their actions.
True, and the older you get. But anyway.
But Amir does go on to address the whole 200 hertz thing. So let me read this next little passage. Okay. We're not going to be able to read the whole comment. And I'm sorry, everybody should go read this comment because we are going to elide some of it. And that's not fair to Amir, but we're going to just touch on the stuff that you want to address, Brent. So the next thing he says is, no, it's not about the acquisition device. We all understand that you can use anything to measure a speaker, but you well know that room reflections corrupt bass response, so you either need to use an anechoic chamber, stitch ground plane measurement response, or clippable near-field scanner with field separation. Danny doesn't use any of this, so to claim that he is doing what Harman, etc. are doing is just wrong. Go ahead and look at the response of any speaker he sells. You won't find measurements in the bass. Where else have you found a company showing speaker measurements that are just gated and start at 200 hertz?
Well, again, I haven't seen everything Danny's done, but the notion that he somehow is completely ignorant of the need for bass response or is somehow incapable of doing it is preposterous to me. And like I said, it's unfathomable that, and again, I have demonstrated experience with these speaker systems, and I have not seen that Amir does outside of a clip, right? Again, I haven't watched all his stuff. God knows I have not looked at all the threads on Audio Science Review, okay? And so I think if Danny is not showing that, it's because he feels he doesn't need to. I'm quite confident that if Danny needed to show the bass, he would show it. And these guys, look, there's a long history. Damn it, I've been doing this longer than anybody but Atkinson, okay? The other people that were doing it longer are dead. And every time, somebody new comes up, it happens over and over. It happened with me, for God's sake, right? Every time somebody new comes up and they do measurements and their attitude is, I'm doing it right and everybody else is doing it wrong. And it used to be that the more you got involved in the measurement community, you started to realize like, oh, well, maybe not.
Yeah.
But when you have a clipple and you don't need to be involved in the measurement community, and God knows I visited how many speaker companies and saw how they measured, 25, 30, God knows how many, and really worked with this. Whereas like if you go buy a clipple and you just start measuring stuff, unless you really make an effort to go out there and interact with people, you're kind of siloed, right?
Yeah.
And I really think he's siloed. And I've had manufacturers say the same thing, that, where it's like, I bought my gear and now I do measurements and I'm right. Everybody else is wrong. But, so many people have been through that and they change, they get involved with other people, they learn from other people, and they start to moderate what they say, and they learn that they're not always right. And I don't think there's a feedback loop on Audio Science Review, not much of one.
I know a lot of people who are banned there, and that to me, I don't know what they were banned for, but that to me is always a little concerning, but that may just be sort of confirmation bias. There's one other segment of Amir's, two other things that I want to get to, but this one first. Is I have to admit I'm a little confused of what prompted this comment from Amir. He says, as to Harman, they have measured speakers with the arrival of Dr. Toole with CEA 2034 style measurements. It is their protocol that got ratified as CEA 2034. So to say that they measured speakers before there was CEA 2034 makes no sense. Their spinorama was CEA 2034.
He's completely missing the point. My point there was that all that measurement was done with equipment that is more primitive than a Klippel. Okay. And people are deriding Danny for using a Clio instead of a Klippel, right?
Yeah.
But the Harman measurement, all that Harman research was done, and the Canadian research before it was done with gear that is no more advanced than a Clio, and perhaps in some cases less advanced. Actually, definitely in some cases less advanced. And so that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, the fact there's a new piece of gear out there doesn't invalidate all that stuff, and all the research we have was done with much more primitive gear than a Klippel. Okay, so I think he just missed the point there. We know that's what we were saying. Is like CTA 2034 was done with primitive gear, and that's what all the science he's using was all done with much more primitive gear than he has.
Yeah. Finally, he says, Rick is super knowledgeable about speakers, their measurements, and design. He is my expert DIY speaker builder. And it's an appeal to authority, Amir. I don't like that.
Yeah.
And evaluator. He knows everything you said and then some. I suggest not throwing rocks at people before learning who they are and what they know. What he criticizes about Danny's work is identical to what I've said, and per above has substantial weight. Any response to that?
Well, I'm disappointed that he made an appeal to authority.
Yeah,
that was a giant. It was a huge disappointment to me. But I've never heard. The thing is, we didn't criticize Rick. We criticized him for criticizing Danny for things that I think are invalid, right? And again, I don't know this guy. He's done some DIY stuff. Have these guys done actual, professional audio product development? I don't think they have.
I don't know.
And I have. And I don't sit in my house measuring speakers. I've been out all over for 30-something years. I've been out visiting manufacturers, seeing the way they do things. And frankly, these guys just don't even have a fraction of that experience. I mean, that's a big problem, is that like you can go buy this stuff and you're suddenly an expert and you don't have the experience in doing DIY kits. Well, that's nice, but lots of people do that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't give you any kind of perspective on how things are actually done.
Yeah. And before someone accuses you of hypocrisy, I know you don't do Reddit much.
Yeah, not much.
There's a very common saying on Reddit, you need to touch grass, right? And basically that's saying, hey, you're in a silo here. You're way too online. You need to get out in the real world, right?
Yeah.
And what you're saying with regard to your experience is not, I know you well enough to speak for you on this front. You're not saying, I have this experience, therefore I am right. It's merely what you're saying is, like, I've been on the business end of this. I've done the stuff that had to be right because people were selling it, right?
Yeah.
I've I've been in the measurement chain that actually matters. And I don't think you're saying because of that you are right, but I think you're saying you have experience that's more relevant. You think that would be accurate?
Yeah.
Like your experience had to be right.
I know. Here's the thing.
There was a lot on the line.
Right. And I know the way things are done to a far, far, far greater degree than you do if you just start up your website and start reviewing speakers, right? I mean, you had back then, that was the only way to do it. There was no, and if you wanted to learn, you couldn't. There were almost no books. There was the LMS book, which was great. Yeah. There was, which was not commercially available unless you bought an LMS. There was, Vance Dickinson's book, which touches on a lot of stuff. He's in edition 8 right now, which gets a lot deeper into measurement. But, there was a little bit in there. Joe D'Appolito wrote a book, 15 years ago at least, that gets into it. But there just wasn't a lot of information now. But again, you don't have to go through that. If you have the $100,000 to spend on a Klippel, you don't have to go through all that process. You don't have to go through that learning. You don't have to go through Jedi training. You just go buy your lightsaber and you're a Jedi.
Yeah. Well, to wrap this one up, I want to say, Amir, sorry about the whole drama with your comment. I'm sorry if you thought we were responsible for that. That was YouTube's fault. And also, everybody listening, we will link to this episode on YouTube specifically in the show notes for this one so you can read Amir's comment in full, because I did not read the entire thing. And like, that comment deserves to be read in full. So you can have the entire context. I think Amir misunderstood a lot of what we were saying, but you know, I don't I don't want to use my editing here as evidence for that. People should go read the full comment.
Touch grass, man. That's a good one.
What have I done? All right. On that note, let's go take a break, get a drink of water, and come back and talk about Sonos.
All right. Back. This is Audio
Unleashed.
And we're going to talk about a little company called Sonos that makes audio stuff. And, you know, Sonos, I think it's worth pointing out again, Sonos really revolutionized the audio industry. You know, it was dominated for so long by Bose. But then Sonos came out with these networked, you know, multi-room audio systems, and they by and large sounded good. And they ended up kind of slowly, in many ways, taking over the audio business and becoming one of the big brands that everybody then had to copy.
Yeah.
But now Sonos, and I kind of don't really review a lot of Sonos products, an occasional sound bar here and there. But I'm not the person who does that at Wirecutter. You are. And so, you know, but I noticed when I got this letter from Sonos, you know, email, I sent email. There's a letter sent via email from Patrick Spence, the head of the CEO, and, you know, apologizing for all the issues that they've had with their app updates and saying, you know, they're going to do better stuff and blah, blah. And then I quickly went to Wirecutter and be like, oh, how are they going to incorporate this in there? And I saw that the recommendation had been pulled after more than 10 years, I think, of recommending Sonos. And that was you. So I wanted to see if maybe you want to talk about the problems that they've had with the app and, you know, talk about why you finally soured on Sonos. Ooh, that kind of has a good ring to it. Soured on Sonos. And,
let me be clear about something, though.
Go ahead.
I actually haven't soured on Sonos as speakers. I still think they make great speakers, right? Mm-hmm. It's the ecosystem that's the problem. It's the app. So, yeah, I mean, I guess just to give people background, you know, every once in a while we update these guides and I go through and I do a bunch of testing on this one. And does this work? Does that work? How's the new firmware? Are there any new contenders? And when this Sonos update came out, it's kind of like, well, we need to do something about this, right? And the intent was, well, we're going to have like a 2-paragraph blurb in the, you know, our top picks section saying, hey, here's what the new update did. Here's what we like. Here's what we don't like. And I played around with it. And I went to my editor and it was like, this is bad. Like, this is really bad. And then I know some communications started going on the Slack channel and everybody was saying, yeah, this is bad. Reddit was blowing up. This is bad. And I was like, I just don't feel good about recommending just going out and buying a Sonos system anymore. Right.
Yeah.
They have betrayed the faith of their customers too many times now. And they've, to me, demonstrated that they are putting the demands of their shareholders above the needs of their users. And yeah, I don't know how you could stand behind them as a just buy it recommendation anymore, because there's so many problems and there's so many things that they're broken, and they're now promising, well, they're going to come back in some form. We're working on this. Well, they shouldn't have broken it to begin with, because I mean, this proves that, well, the next time shareholders demand something, like, I think this is my opinion. This is not going in the guide. I'm not speaking for Wirecutter. I'm speaking for me personally. I think what happened here is they had to figure out how to make their headphones work with their ecosystem because shareholders said, you've been saying this is coming. It better come now. And I think in trying to make the headphones work, they broke everything.
So just can you give us an example of what was one of the things that broke? What was one of the things you found annoying about it?
The biggest thing for me personally, and I'm not emphasizing this too much in the story because this probably doesn't apply to most people. The thing is, most of the things they broke don't apply to most people. For me, the biggest is you can no longer access your local library, right? I'm a deadhead. I've got gigs and gigs and gigs and gigs of music on my phone, on my iPhone. There are Grateful Dead releases 4 times a year that will never hit any of the streaming services. The only way they're on my phone or accessible on my phone is if I rip them and move them over, right? Yeah. So now to not be able to access my local library, I know I'm weird in that respect, but you've just broken the ecosystem for me. They broke timers and alarms, which I never used those, right? I never would have considered that to be important functionality. But to the small percentage of people for whom it was a major thing, well, you just broke Sonos. And accessibility functionality. I'm fortunate in that I don't need any of that, right? But for the people who do need that, well, now you've just cut them off of Sonos entirely. Again, are they the majority? No. And it is sort of a death by 1,000 tiny cuts thing. I've had conversations before where people are like, well, that's no big deal. Well, that's no big deal. Well, 1,000 tiny deals add up to a big deal, right? And what happened with this new update is they basically stripped it down to what a lot of people are calling an MVP, a minimum viable product. And what they've honestly done is sort of reduced Sonos to an experience where, and what it's made me realize is, oh gosh, AirPlay is so much better. Not as just a one-to-one device thing. AirPlay is better as a multi-room ecosystem now.
Wow.
I mean, adding and removing zones. We've written in the update guide several times, like Apple, if you got a phone, whatever, it's fine, but it's a little kludgy. Well, Apple's been making tiny little improvements over time that just sort of like, it's a frog in a pot kind of thing. And all of a sudden, this has forced me to realize, man, Apple AirPlay is a really good multi-room ecosystem. Okay, if you're an Apple guy. What if you're an Android guy? Here's a problem I don't know, so I'm having to get an Android phone to figure it out. But the long and short of it is Sonos as an ecosystem is just not something I can stand behind as a recommendation anymore. Well, and I'm thankful, beyond thankful, that my editors are backing me up on this.
I'm shocked. I did not realize they took away, local access of files, right? Yeah. Because that was the whole thing they started with. They started before the streaming services happened. I mean, I still remember, they came to me in my office at Home Entertainment Magazine, Malibu, California, because they're in Santa Barbara, so it was not too long of a drive. And they brought me this thing. I think it was that original amp that they had that had like a little 50 watt per channel Class D in there. Hell, it might have been Class AB for all I know. I can't remember. It's that long ago. And he showed me how it, you had this little remote that didn't work on, there were no smartphones then. Okay. You couldn't, there were no apps. App was like not even a term we used. Right. And, he showed me how you had this remote control, or you could get on your computer and you could control all this stuff, and you could stream stuff off of your networked computer or your networked hard drive or whatever. I mean, Wi-Fi was not really even all that common back then. And they came out and, other manufacturers were just starting to do networked audio, and they came out and had it all working, and it was all about accessing your local drives. And then they added all the streaming services once those started to happen. And I'm just shocked that they pulled that because, I mean, granted, a lot of people just use it to stream, Spotify or whatever, but just to take that feature that kind of built them off of there, to me, is just bizarre.
Here's another thing in the mea culpa letter that I actually forgot about. They're given a timeline for when they're going to try to have stuff that they've broken fixed. And if you get all the way down to the end, By October, they're saying they hope to restore the ability to edit playlists in your queue. Like you can't do that. You can't build a playlist or edit your queue in any way, shape, or form right now through the Sonos app. And that is core functionality. Just absolutely core functionality. But like I hinted out at the intro, I still think Sonos makes great speakers, man. The new Era 100 and 300. I mean, if you're just wanting a really cool, like the 300 specifically, a really cool sort of Atmos speaker with really great room correction that you can use in your kitchen or bathroom. That's the thing. I've had over the years a number of Bluetooth speakers in my bathroom, and they all kind of sound like they're in a bathroom. And Sonos is, what is it called? True Tune or whatever like that. Their room correction, whatever they call it. Yeah. You can make a Sonos speaker sound freaking neutral in a bathroom or a kitchen. There are not a lot of other speakers you can say that about. So it's not like I'm going to be saying, just to be clear, this guide is still very much in development, but I'm spoiling some things here. I'm not saying don't buy Sonos speakers. Like they are still absolutely great speakers, and some of them are right for the right room. If you need room correction in a room, and if you're in a kitchen or a bathroom, you might benefit from it. They're still great, but just once you're done with that, forget the app. And more importantly, I don't really see that there's any benefit in building a whole home's worth of Sonos, because I am right now in a multi-room system using a combination of Sonos speakers, Blue OS speakers, Denon and Marantz AVRs and preamps. AirPlay is so pervasive these days that it's kind of like, well, who cares what the brand of the speaker I'm sending it to is? So put together a piecemeal system. Put together the system that's right for you. Forget about the Sonos app because it's stupid and it doesn't work. You know?
So, all right, last question. Do you think Sonos, what do you think is the future of Sonos?
I think they're going to suffer a little bit from this. I just don't know how much. I don't have a business mind. We've said that before. I don't know. But I will say this. I've rarely seen companies get this much backlash and this little defense and thrive in the long run. Yeah. You know, normally any company, any big corporation that has done something this stupid and generates this much outrage, you've got a serious contingent of fanboys who come in and go, well, this isn't that bad. This is just, you just need to use it different, right? Yeah. I'm not seeing anybody defend Sonos, buddy. I mean, you go on the Sonos subreddit and it's on fire. There is nobody going, well, this isn't too bad. So look, they're an 800-pound gorilla. Do they have the marketing and PR budget to spend their way out of this? Yeah, I think they do, but it's going to be a hard fight, man.
It kind of feels like Microsoft to me a little bit, or especially like Microsoft from 10, 15, 20 years ago, where they just didn't really give a damn what their customers thought. They're just like, hey, you know what? People have to use us, so tough. And you know, Microsoft, I think especially like under Steve Ballmer, really just at that point did not care about the customer experience at all. They just acted like people had no choice but to use them. And in fact, they didn't have any choice but to use them. And you know, honest to God, I had to use Microsoft Word for a project, you know, and to have to go back and use that thing, it's not as good as Google Docs. Yeah. I mean, it's not, it's just like they didn't even care about like making it work. And Google, I think, still actually cares about making Google Docs work. But it took a good 20 years, more than that, really, 25 years for Microsoft to really start to have to pay the price. And they're still one of the 2 or 3 most valuable companies by market cap.
That's a good point.
So,
That's a really good point.
You know, maybe Sonos looks at that and says, you know what, we're entrenched. People have bought into our ecosystem. We'll be fine. And yeah, it's a little bump, but you know, we'll come back and people will be like, well, I've already got 4 Sonos speakers. I got to buy another speaker. I guess I'll just buy a Sonos again.
Yeah, I think that's my point, though. They don't really need to. There are so many speakers now that are perfectly compatible with it.
But they'll think they need to.
That's a good point.
And you know, that cool reversible logo.
I forgot about the logo. Yeah.
Bowers and Wilkins doesn't have that.
Forget everything I said. Sonos is still king. No, I'm kidding.
All right.
Well, I think I've said about enough about this. What about you?
I have so little to say. I haven't reviewed I haven't done an in-depth review of the Sonos product for ages, so I'm out of it.
Well, let's go talk about your morning coffee then.
Let's do it.
All right, we'll be right back. Back to audio
Unleashed.
So we're talking about your favorite podcast for this segment. This is, or at least the podcast that you send me links to the most. This is Your Morning Coffee. This is a special episode with the guest Will Page.
Yeah.
So as we hinted at in the intro, this entire thing was just a fascinating discussion for me because it's largely about a topic that I think people would think is a little nerdy. Basically, how do streaming services decide who gets how much pay? And Will really breaks down sort of the different ways. And you and I have talked about before. Basically, is there a big pot? And, if you generate the most listens, then you get the biggest cut of that pot? Or is it more user focused? Whereas if I listen to nothing but King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard on Apple Music for the entire month, do they get my entire whatever I pay for Apple Music? I don't know. I'm in a family plan. And he talks about different ways of other ways of thinking about it, which, one of the ways is sort of the completion method is, do people actually finish listening to the song? There's a lot we could go into, but you're the one who sent me the link to this. What stood out to you as the most fascinating? Why did you want to discuss this?
Well, what stood out to me, and we should say Your Morning Coffee is done by Jake Gilbert and Mike Etchart, and they are industry, they're sort of like us, but for music industry, they're guys who've been doing it their whole lives, and they're both about, I think, probably 60-ish now. And so they can go really, really, really deep. And Will Page is an economist who focuses on the music industry. And so they dig really deep into this stuff, and they really have the knowledge to understand what's going on. So what blew me away is Will Page was talking about how, different countries have different laws governing the pay structure for streaming services, which I didn't realize that. And then
that was revelatory.
I thought it was kind of the Wild West still, but no, there are laws governing this. And it's, what counts as a stream? So obviously you wouldn't want, if you're clicking through stuff real fast and you maybe accidentally hit on, oh God, the Eagles or something, right? Or maybe you intentionally hit on the Eagles. But let's just say you're Brent or Dennis and you accidentally hit the Eagles and you're like, screw this, get me out of here as fast as possible. And you end up listening to it for 5 seconds, right? Well, should the Eagles collect money on that? Well, probably not, right? So the law in the U.S. is that it has to play for 30 seconds. And that means you get credited for a stream. However, you don't get any extra credit beyond that. So, if you've got like a John Coltrane thing that's 20 minutes, let's update that. Let's go with a Christian McBride thing that's like a 20-minute, jazz exploration of something, right? Well, he gets the same amount of credit for playtime as something that only lasts for 30 seconds. I mean, I don't think there are any tunes that last for 30 seconds, but he gets the same credit.
There's some Beastie Boys tracks that last for 30 seconds or less.
Okay, well,
and some They Might Be Giants.
Okay, but like I mean, the Ramones, who had some tunes that were less than 2 minutes, would get as much credit as Christian McBride does for something that lasts for 20, right? Even though you're listening for 20 as opposed to 2.
Right.
And apparently there have been problems with a lot of stream farms that, are set up to artificially jack up the number of streams, and they only play the song for 31 seconds, then they bail. But anyway, so what's happening is artists are incentivized to get people to hang on for 30 seconds, right? After that, doesn't really matter. So they've been, Will points out, they're putting, there's an old saying in the music industry, don't bore us, get to the chorus, right? And, the chorus is the big, dopamine boosting part that's real big and exciting sounding, right? And so now people are starting to put that in the beginning of the tune. Right. So instead of building up to something, you get this big immediate ba 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 ba, right? And
people of my generation would think of how wild it was, like when Bon Jovi did "Living on a Prayer" and they started with the chorus, like that grabbed you, right?
Yeah. And
now it's ubiquitous; everybody's doing it, right?
Everybody has to sound like Bon Jovi now. And who's to say that's a bad thing?
Me? Can I say it's a bad thing? I want to say that's a bad thing.
That's the whole point is, there had been, I'm going to say that top 40 in a way, at least for a long time, 30 years, has been a fairly grifty genre, right? It's been designed to create this dopamine boost, much like a slot machine, right? And it's the tunes have largely been crafted to where you get this big dopamine boost, and you kind of it's got a whole arc. Yeah. It's sort of like a novel, like most novels have a predictable arc, right? And it really cuts into the creativity. But look at what we have now. We have the dominant genres now are top 40 style genres, either top 40 itself, which is top 40 is an amalgam of, some hip hop, some R&B, some things that are a little more EDM-ish, except now country also, country incorporating elements of hip hop that is, this sort of big sounding stuff that immediately grabs you. And my thought is, look, audiophiles tend to listen to, jazz, classical, world music, folk, stuff like that, right? Mm-hmm. So the genres that audiophiles tend to like are being, I don't want to say shut down, but it's becoming even more difficult to make money on those genres. And they're getting like no streams to speak of. And I don't know of a jazz artist that makes money on streams. Kenny G maybe. Because, streaming is so biased towards catalog content, old stuff that people are familiar with, right? And so Kenny G probably still makes a little money on streaming and maybe a few other smooth jazz artists and, maybe like, the Miles Davis estate makes a little money on his streams because, people still play Kind of Blue a lot, right? But the current jazz artists, I think, probably make something pretty close to nothing on their streams. And
right.
It used to be back in the record selling days that, you could, Dexter Gordon or somebody could make a record in a day with no rehearsal because they got top-notch players and they bang out these records in a day. And if they sold 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 copies, they made money. They made like decent money on that. Not Britney Spears money, but decent money. And it was fine. Whereas now, since if you have your, what was it, John Coltrane at the Village Vanguard, I think the one with Eric Dolphy, there's 2 tunes on it. So if you stream the whole album, you get basically 2 streams. You get credit for 2 streams, as opposed to a typical pop album now, which is going to they have a lot of songs on them now. They have, I was looking at the new, somebody, I don't know, Billie Eilish or somebody album, and, actually listening to it, it had like 15, 16, 17 tunes on it.
Yeah.
And which they're getting credit for 15, 16, 17 streams if somebody listens to that, whereas John Coltrane gets credit for 2 streams. So, John Coltrane, I don't want to speak for John Coltrane, but, I
don't think you've done enough drugs to speak for John Coltrane.
No, but anyway, whoever the contemporary, I don't think there is a contemporary equivalent of John Coltrane, but let's say, who's that sax player? Nathaniel Wilkins. It's great. No, Emmanuel Wilkins. That's right. I think there's also a guy named Nathaniel Wilkins. Anyway, Emmanuel Wilkins. Great young sax player. He's got some fairly long form stuff. Or Kamasi Washington, right? Those guys are
I know him.
Yeah, those guys are not going to be getting the number of streams just because their tunes are a lot longer, right? And so they are sort of artificially demonetized by streaming. And the people that make big sounding stuff that grabs you right away, which I will just say is probably not the best path to long-term appeal over the years. I think a lot of the really super, super poppy stuff gets lost and forgotten really quickly, whereas the stuff with more depth to it, tends to stick around a lot longer. I mean, Joni Mitchell or, I don't know, Wilco or something, right? So,
well, go back to like 1968 and look at the Billboard Top 100, right? Mm-hmm. There's some really good stuff like at the top, right? But, Hey Jude. But then there's some stuff like number 2 is Love is Blue by Paul Moriarty. I've never heard of that.
Wow.
Honey by Bobby Goldsboro. And then number 4, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. It's like, if you look at the top 10, there's like 4 of them that I've heard of. Right?
Wow.
So it's like the top 40 or whatever is never indicative of the stuff that endures. And it's also, I've got this foolhardy quest. I've convinced myself that I can get kids into hi-fi, right? Mm-hmm. I know it's foolish. I know I'm going to fail, but my attempt is largely to sort of meet them where they are and not say, oh, you're doing it wrong, but go to them and go, well, what are you doing, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm realizing most of them that I talk to, and when I say kids, I'm talking about like people under 25, right? That's kids to me. They're not listening to anything that's in the top 40, man. I mean, none of it. But I ask them what they're listening to, and they're very enthusiastic about stuff I have just never heard of.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, Will Page in this episode of Your Morning Coffee, I forget the exact words he used, but the concepts are something like lean back music and lean forward music, right? And he talks about how like the streaming services really want you leaning back. They want you to just be a passive listener and not really engaged. And if you're leaning forward and you're going to skip stuff, right? That's bad. That's bad for them, right? And I think that's almost the part of this that's worse, is that they're training people to just sort of, like, it's a minimum viable product like Sonos is doing. They want you to get unoffended enough to where you're just going to lean back in your chair and not be reaching for any button that's going to skip a track. They want to control your experience. And I wonder how many people are even really listening to the music that they're quote unquote listening to.
Boy, that's a good point.
I think for a lot of people, as soon as it enters their consciousness, then they're all of a sudden in lean forward mode, and they've sort of defied the whole purpose of streaming, right? There's a lot of layers to unpack here, and I'm not even sure I've begun to figure out what those layers are, but there's a lot in this episode that just sort of planted seeds of thoughts in me that I'm going to be ruminating on for a long time.
Yeah. And we've talked about, like Spotify's practice of pushing these like Swedish so-called artists that are doing music that's very quickly, sort of chill music that's very quickly cranked out, or maybe it's even AI generated, who knows? That's just quickly banged out. And, Spotify can push that. And it appears that they would do that so they pay less royalties, or maybe no royalties. Maybe they do a buyout. Who knows? But it's just sort of, I was talking with a music industry consultant last week. I probably shouldn't name him. I'm not sure if it's, but he's managed a lot of big bands and things like that. And he was telling me rock is the new jazz because it was created for a different era and a different economic structure, right? It was created for albums. Rock, really long playing albums gave birth to rock, as opposed to
album-oriented rock, AOR,
as
man.
opposed to just pop. Because, the Beatles, let's face it, the Beatles were still making 3-minute tunes, right?
Yeah.
Even though they were one of the first acts that really got people to buy albums. And it's because of the LP that people could start to make longer tunes and et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't exist anymore. So if you are a rock act and you're not banging out some big giant chorus like Bon Jovi in the first 30 seconds, you are kind of, if you're, I don't know, let's see if I can name a current rock band. Can you name a current rock band? Like a relatively new one?
I've named them in this episode. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. They're huge.
How long have they been around?
About 10 years.
Okay, that's not too bad. I was going to say there's like...
And they really started breaking big, I think, in about 2019 is when they really started to... Like, that's when they started selling out Red Rocks for 3 nights in a row, right? So they've been around for a while, but they're really just in the past few years starting to become huge. Other ones, Eggy, Geese.
Are you looking this up?
No.
Okay.
No. I'm talking about rock bands that I listen to.
Okay.
There are probably a lot that I've never heard of, but yeah.
But see, I can't name any. And not that it's come along in the last probably 10 years. And I do kind of seek it out a little bit. I mean, frankly, the genre has lost some of its luster. You know, there was a heyday of Metallica and people like that, you know, the sort of speed metal, for want of a better term. And it kind of devolved into what was like Godsmack, where every tune sounded like, and there's no space in it at all. And then there was a band called Power Trip out of Texas that actually kind of revived the whole speed metal thing with some new twists, and they were amazing. But then their lead singer died. They were awesome though; they were so cool. But I kind of haven't heard anything recently that really grabbed me enough to remember who it was. Whereas I can name tons of top 40 artists. I can name a zillion. I can even name some country artists that are contemporary.
You know, that brings up a good point. Here's the thing, looping back to what I said earlier. You know, when I was a kid, and when you were a kid, I'm sure too, even if you weren't into top 40, you knew what was on the top 40, right?
Oh yeah.
These kids that I'm talking to, like, you go through the top 40 and they're like, I've never heard of that person, right? What are you talking about? Like, nobody listens to that, right? And so it's like their generation isn't even really aware that the top 40 is a thing. And I wonder if the top 40 is just becoming irrelevant. It's just sort of a circle jerk almost.
I totally disagree. I mean, I think it's very relevant. It's got so much... It's got so much cultural exposure now. I mean, like I said, I can just sit here and name top 40 artists off the top of my head easily, a bunch of them. You know, and there's new ones coming up all the time, and they get a lot of attention. And I think maybe you're just talking to kids that don't have their finger on the pulse of the culture like I do.
Maybe you're just cooler than the kids these days.
I know what's going on. I'll tell these kids what's going on.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap it up and do some credits. You want to wrap it up and do some credits?
Yeah. So this is a Butterburger production.
Good job, buddy.
And
I'm and
it will be edited by the second half of Butterburger, which is Dennis Berger.
It's me.
It's you.
Yeah. So So if the editing's really bad, blame me.
I don't think we're going to have new music because I have like a lot of. I still have my big secret project we haven't discussed in the podcast, but we have discussed privately,
Mystery.
Which I have a lot of editing to do on, but I'm deep into Dolby Atmos, people. So you're going to be hearing some Atmos headphone mixes and stuff pretty soon on here. That'll be maybe good, maybe not, maybe dumb, but who cares? I'm embracing the new technology.
Yeah. All right, man. Anything else?
No,
I can't think of anybody we need to credit.
Thank all the people that left messages on YouTube and Patreon and wherever else they leave us messages. And
the ones that supported us and the ones that challenged us, because we cherish both. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good conversation. And you know, look, all of these people are making a contribution, right? I go to Amir's site sometimes to find out. It's like, I'm kind of interested in this speaker. Let's see who's actually measured this thing. And you know, he's measures at least as many speakers as anybody. And I've gotten some really great information off of that site. Just like I've gotten some great information off Danny's site. I've gotten great information from Aaron. I've gotten great information from Audioholics, from Soundstage, et cetera, et cetera. All these people are making a contribution. And, I would like to think we are above the fray a little bit, except we kind of keep getting down into the fray, but whatever.
We're afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, everybody, thanks for joining us so much. We appreciate it. Hey, if anybody wants to go leave us a review on iTunes or, leave a comment on YouTube, we would not be mad about that.
Yeah.
Thank you. It helps us reach more people and cause more controversy.
Even if you say we suck, you wouldn't be the first.
Yeah. That is a true story. All right. Thanks, everybody. And patrons, stick around. We got one more for you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end. If you liked what you heard and wish there'd been a little bit more of it, we got some good news for you.
Indeed, we do. If you check out patreon.com/Audio Unleashed, all one word, you can get new episodes a little earlier than everybody else.
And sometimes it's like a day or two early. Sometimes it's nearly a week. We never really know until we start editing.
But the big plus is that you get extended cuts of every episode. And usually that's going to mean a whole extra segment that's about maybe a geekier topic or something that's a little more personal to us or something that's just going to really appeal to the hardcore Audio Unleashed listener.
Yeah, what it boils down to is if you're somebody who would support Audio Unleashed on Patreon, we're going to make sure the bonuses to every episode are really aimed straight at your interests.
Yeah, and so if you want to hear these segments, you can subscribe to our Patreon for $3 a month, which is less than I spend every single day on my cup of coffee when I go to Starbucks to write my boring articles.
Yeah. One more time with that URL, that's patreon.com/Audio Unleashed.
Or Audio
Unleashed. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.